So I'm unmuted. So right now, are folks on live stream able to hear me?
Let me see.
So right now, are folks on live stream able to hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Cool. I'll go back on mute, and then you're going to give me the high sign when to start, right?
All right. Sounds good.
Live stream able to hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll go back.
Hey, David, we're 2 minutes away from 7 o'clock.
Okay, why don't you pop it up and I'll talk to people a little bit.
Go for it.
Okay. Hey, folks. We're just getting things finalized here, bringing in some new light so that we can get some brighter light over here. I need the big one, the other one. We're just bringing over some lights. Got to get it all settled up here. I think we're going to be good to go this time. So just hang tight and we'll be rolling. You can see the slides are ready to go. Awesome. What would you like this one? And the need extension over there. I got it. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Broadcasting live from my basement. Gonna ask my producer Wole a question here. Wole, is that too much light right there, or is that good?
That's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the mic is turned towards you.
Yeah, sure is.
Great.
Put the mic right in the middle.
Don't do that because it'll be in front of the camera. So just off to the side a little bit.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. Hey, everybody. Just getting the last little bits tucked away here. Going to get started in about 2 or 3 minutes. Ready to go? Good evening, everybody. David here. People are just logging on and joining us. It's kind of like that last few minutes before, if we were in Kane Hall before the lecture would start, and everybody's look at the clock and it's 7 o'clock, and but we're just waiting for the last couple minutes to kind of come in, last couple folks to come on in. What a beautiful day outside today, huh? Just lovely, sunny. It's been nice and so warm. I mean, it just makes such a difference to be able to walk around outside and see things. Beautiful. Do phone calls, talk to people, do some of my work out there. This little kind of area here in the basement is where I'm now doing a lot of my work. Got a little bookcase over there. We're We're going to get started. I'll get rolling right into this at 7:05. In this world of ours now where remote communications is so essential to all that we're doing, it's such an interesting experience to give a talk to, I know, to a bunch of people, but I have to imagine you all in my mind. That's interesting. And it's kind of, fortunately I have pretty, very clear sense and memories of what Kane Hall looks like and the people in the hall and all of that. We'll go one more minute here. And Wole, I'm going to assume that if anything needs my attention, something going on, you're just going to cut in and stop me. But other than that, I'll assume we're going well.
Go for it.
Okay. Hey, everybody. Welcome tonight to the second lecture here in the New Birth of Freedom, America, Democracy in 2020, in the second lecture in the April series. Really glad to have you with us. I'm David Domke, and I'm broadcasting live from my studio here in the kind of basement of our house. We've set up a nice little work area over here. So I got a little desk in front of me, got a window in front of me. That's where you can see the sunlight hitting the wall behind me. The sun will be down or beyond the trees here shortly. Got some of my books, things I've brought over here from the University of Washington, some of the things that I pull off and look at and use. Just not bad at all. I mean, all things considered, right? Really fortunate. Today is a day that I'm just really struck by how much the coronavirus is devastating to the United States. More than 2,300 people, as far as we know, in terms of the count, died today from COVID-19. That is not a whole lot, not a large number fewer, so very close in number to the number of casualties, deaths on D-Day in 1944. So this is a moment of grave concern for our country. I appreciate you all joining us tonight. Some of you are going to be watching on Zoom, and some of you are just watching the live stream directly on YouTube. Either one of those is fine. It's great. One thing that is different between the two is that on Zoom, I'll be able to take some of your questions at the end of my lecture. So if you have questions, you're welcome to pop them into the Q&A chat. I'm sorry, the Q&A area on Zoom. Otherwise, if you're on Zoom, no questions, or if you're on the live stream, won't be able to do questions with you. On Zoom we can, on live stream we won't be able to just do questions to you directly. We're really glad you're here. I'm excited. I like doing these lectures. You know that I've got this one and then the next one coming up. So here's where we're at, the overview of the lectures. I did the lecture series in January, 3 lectures about the Democrats. I spoke first about 1864 as a parallel moment in American history, a crucible moment. Then I talked about the way in which the calendar of the primary and caucuses mattered. And then I went through and talked about the candidates and made the case that Joe Biden was in the strongest position because of his support among African Americans, and that would make a difference. wasn't always clear that that was going to play out that way, but indeed it did and has. The last lecture I did on April 7th, last Tuesday, was the first of the Republicans, where I talked about the kind of unprecedented or uncharted waters that we're in right now. And then I'll do tonight and next week, and then I'll do the nation lectures next this fall, hopefully in person. Tonight's lecture is the second of the 3 here in the middle series, and the title is The Cult of Trump. It's a title that I came up with a few months ago. One of the things that goes into these lectures is I have to name them in advance of when I actually deliver them, so that people can know about them and can register for them. So I always have to have the titles of the overall series and the titles of the individual lectures. And I give my best guess to the content that I'm going to want to talk about, or what I think will be important to talk about a few months later. So I named this one The Cult of Trump. And when I did it, when I named that, I thought, that's a kind of a strong word. Cult, is that going to be really an appropriate terminology? And I now, having put the lecture together and in preparing to deliver it tonight, it is exactly the right word, unfortunately. So welcome tonight to the lecture series here, or the second lecture in this middle, the second lecture in these April series, The Cult of Trump. All right. I want to start with Donald Trump, the person. All right. I've done a number of lectures over the last couple of years, examining Trump, unpacking him, looking at his connection to Roy Cohn, his father, the way that he approaches politics and conflict generally. But I want to start tonight in some of his own words, Donald Trump in his own words. And there are so many words just alone. Today in the press briefing, there were probably thousands. All right. But I want to pick out a few select ones along the way. In January 2016, he said, I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue in New York and shoot somebody, and I wouldn't lose voters. In July of that year, he said, nobody knows, and this was at the Republican convention, nobody knows the system better than me, which is why I alone can fix it. In August of 2019, he said, I am the chosen one. And he was out doing a press interaction with the news media on the lawn of the White House, and he looked up to, I guess, the heavens and said, I am the chosen one. And of course, his defense always on these things is that I'm only joking. Don't take me seriously. And then just yesterday, he said, when somebody's president of the United States, the authority is total. And that's the way it's got to be. It's total. These are not subtle claims. They are narcissistic. They are self-focused. They are claims about the power and the infallibility of him as a human being. All of these lead me to call it the cult of Trump. And it turns out there's a book called The Cult of Trump, which I didn't know when I named the title of this lecture. This book came out in late autumn of 2019, so just a few months ago, by Steven Hassan. And Steven Hassan is someone who himself was in a what you would call a cult kind of community, broke out of that, and then has become a psychological expert on examining the cultural phenomena of cults, in which so the subtitle of the book is A Leading Cult Expert Explains How the President Uses Mind Control. Now again, this is pretty dramatic of a statement to say, how the president uses mind control. All right. The lecture here, though, is called The Cult of Trump. And I want to think about this to start out a little bit here, the idea of mind control. Not in some kind of like woo-woo, crazy like ESP kind of mindset, although maybe some of you will buy into that. But so not any of that, but more in just the psychological practices and the ways in which rewards are delivered and pain is delivered in order to enact a certain kind of structure of control. All right. So let's just as an exhibit on this, let's talk about Lindsey Graham, okay? Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina. Lindsey Graham has, over the course of his time as a U.S. Senator, been very close friends with John McCain, has been considered by most Democrats to be one of their favorite Republican colleagues. He, by all indications, is very funny and quite moderate and reasonable behind the scenes. And when McCain was around, they along with Joe Lieberman, former Democratic congressman from Connecticut, were kind of considered, they called themselves the Three Amigos, and they were seen as really working bipartisan terms. So let's look at what Graham had to say back in 2015 and 16 about Donald Trump. He said, Trump or Cruz, Ted Cruz, it's like being shot or poisoned, okay? Either one, terrible. And he said, Trump is a kook. I think he's crazy. He's unfit for office. This is when Graham was running for the presidency, for the presidential nomination on the Republican side, but also some of these come after he's out of the presidential nomination. He said, Graham said, you know how you make America great again? You tell Donald Trump to go to hell. Okay. All right, Senator Graham, that's nothing subtle about that is all. Graham was telling it how it is. Graham said, he's a race-baiting, xenophobic, religious bigot. Trump doesn't represent my party or people who fight for us. He's ISIS's man of the year. Okie dokie. I would give anything for a Republican who would tell it straight like this today. Lastly, if we nominate Trump, we will get destroyed, and we will deserve it, Graham said. So Lindsey Graham, like his colleague John McCain, had no interest, respect for, or time for Donald Trump as a representative of the Republican Party back in 2015 and 2016. McCain went forward and acted upon these positions in his refusal to go along with Trump on a number of things, most famously when he voted against the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. Graham has taken a different pathway, a very different pathway. And so I want to now pull up some quotes from Graham in the last 3 years, 3+ years since Donald Trump was elected. Graham said some of these. I am the happiest dude in America right now. We have got a president and a national security team that I've been dreaming of for 8 years. Okay. He said, what concerns me about the American press is this endless attempt to label this guy as some kind of kook, not fit to be president. That was exactly Lindsey Graham's words, kook and not unfit, not fit to be president. But now he's defending him. Now, clearly the drug that is known as partisanism and the power of having the presidency in your party is a very powerful drug in American politics. No question about it. But you don't have to throw your kind of soul under the bus to be in the same party and to not say terrible things about each other. Lots of senators probably don't like Trump, but don't need to go as far as Graham went from one end of the continuum to the other. You know, this impeachment, he said not long ago, Salem witches got a better deal than this. And then Graham said, just recently after the State of the Union address, this speech will be talked about long after Trump's second term. This speech is on par with Reagan's tear down this wall speech. Ronald Reagan's speech at the foot of the Berlin Wall in 1987 is a famous speech where he turned, pointed at the wall and said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. That's what he's referencing there. The notion that anything Trump would ever do would be considered in the kind of pantheon of speeches given by presidents who are popular and have had a positive impact on America. There's lots of things about Ronald Reagan's presidency that I do not agree with or want or support, but he is and was a very popular president and did preside over a number of kind of things that were positive in the world. To put Trump in the same category as pretty much any sane president is crazy, let alone to talk about one of his speeches in this kind of caliber. So you got Lindsey Graham that went from one end of the continuum to the other end. I don't know if that's mind control or what, but it is certainly not healthy. It is not healthy. Okay. Let's do Exhibit B. Well, it could be Exhibit B, could be just about any Republican, could be pretty much anybody, unfortunately. All right. I'm just going to take one. Thom Tillis, who's the North Carolina Republican senator. He's was elected in 2014. He's up for re-election this year. He's one of the senators that I'm paying a lot of attention to because he's in a competitive swing state in the United States. Thom Tillis. When Tillis is conservative, there's no question, just as Lindsey Graham is conservative. But Tillis is also somebody who has stood against the president at different times. In 2019, he said that the president was wrong to declare a national emergency for the Mexican-U.S. border. But then he took criticism on Twitter from the president, and he flip-flopped and eventually voted for the president's position on this and came out strongly for it. Well, here's a thing by Derek Willis on Twitter. Willis does some tracking of different candidates and different politicians on Twitter. And he looked at how many times Thom Tillis from his Twitter accounts mentioned Donald Trump from each account and from each year. In 2018, from Thom Tillis's personal account, there was one mention of Trump. In 2018, from the official Senator Thom Tillis account, there were 21 mentions of Donald Trump. In 2019, those numbers go up. From the personal account of Thom Tillis, there are 92 mentions of Trump in the year of 2019. And from the official Senator Thom Tillis account, there's 52. So we go from 22 to 144, a sevenfold increase in 1 year, as Tillis needed to praise this president and to speak warmly of him as he tried to get back into the good graces of the president in 2019 after daring to disagree with Trump on the Mexican-U.S. border issues. But I point out this number, this is in November. I don't know what the final count was. I didn't get anything from Willis in terms of the final tally. But one more example from Tillis. So early this year, Tillis sent out this from his personal account. Eric Trump's birthday is coming up. We're putting together a birthday card for him. Will you add your name? This is just, on the one hand, embarrassing. It's humiliating. It's devastatingly just unpack. It just makes these people look so weak, so simple-minded, so controlled by Donald Trump, so under his thumb, under his power. And unfortunately, we see little bits of this even with the health system right now, with the experts that are coming out and testifying, or at least updating us, whether it's Dr. Fauci or Dr. Birx, the reality of them bringing information that that Trump has massaged and filtered and even had to sign off on. So this kind of mind control, cultish approach has gotten a viral terminology on Twitter among people who are very critical of Donald Trump. It's called the dear leader mindset, which references powerful leaders who would take no dissent, no criticisms, from authoritarians to other psychological or cultural kind of powerful individuals. The dear leader mentality that we see. And unfortunately, this is what the Republican Party has come out and become. I have yet to see anybody today in public who has criticized the president's comments from yesterday that the president's power is total. In 1974, Richard Nixon said famously, infamously, in an interview with David Frost, that if the president does it, it's not illegal. It really undid the president. It was a window into his perspective, his mindset that was unacceptable. Well, we have a window into Trump's mindset. We get it every single day at these briefings and more. But when he says that the president's power is total, he's not joking. This is who he is. And he expects everybody to genuflect at his throne. So this lecture is about how the Republican Party got here. How did we get here? How did the Republicans get to this place? So we'll take 1 second here. How did the Republican Party get here? Let's see. I want to talk about a couple things. The first is what I'm going to call voter racial homogeneity, or basically a kind of racial oneness that is part of the Republican voting supporters. Who votes for the Republican Party? I'm going to talk about the voter racial homogeneity. Okay. This is a overtime tracking of U.S. Census data from 1900 through 2010. The U.S. Census, which we're in the middle of collecting right now, gets collected every 10 years in the United States. And we can track the racial representation in the United States using the categories of the census. And these are not necessarily the categories that I would ideally have, but these are the categories that are common across these years in the census compilations. So I'm going to show you the tracking over time of each of these racially identified groups. And the white population is going to be the largest. And so they're going to go across the top in terms of percentage of the United States. And the Black or African American and the Latinx and the Asian American population is Asian Americans are combined with others over time. So this is it tracking over time from 1900 forward. We see over the last 100 years that the African American population has stayed fairly constant in the low teens, in the around 12, 13, 14% in the United States. The Latino population has increased from a very small percentage to now becoming the second largest single racial or single ethnic grouping in the United States, slightly above African Americans as of the 2010 census. They'll be even a couple more percentage points higher as a group in 2020. And then the Asian and American population, Native American population, and what folks who would identify as mixed race fall into the Asian and other category. And that's been perking up since the 1960s. And the reason that picked up since the 1960s is that in 1965, as one of the kind of amazing piece of legislation passed during the Johnson administration, a piece of legislation that just, I don't know why it doesn't get the level of attention in the American story that I think it deserves. It was the Naturalization and Immigration Act of 1965, which changed immigration laws in this country fundamentally. Until then, it had been almost impossible for people from Asia to legally immigrate to the United States. This had come out of a law passed in 1924, the National Origins Act, that had been deeply racist, building upon formerly a series of other laws all the way back to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 that were hostile, racially prejudiced against Asians and then Asian Americans. But the law in 1965 began to allow people to come from countries in kind of different ways, and slowly populations in Asia began to come, and then began to snowball and bring along families in what's known as chain migration, where you can bring along family members as well to the United States. So Asian Americans are a growing group in the United States. Native Americans continue to be at about 1% of the population over time in the United States, and have been there for, unfortunately, for well back since before 1900. So white population overall, though, is diminishing. We know that as a fact. And when you look at what's projected for 2020 in the census, the white population is expected to come in at around 60%. Right under it is, I think it was 61 or 2% in 2010. I think it's supposed to come in around 59 to 60% of the census data in 2020. These, of course, are folks who are self-identify as Caucasian or white, and and solely in that population. So over time, we have a diversifying United States of America. I'm thrilled about that. It's not going near as quickly as I'd like, but it's going that way. And if you were a political party in that kind of an environment that wanted to be a long-term political party, to have support among voters for a long term and to have powerful support, there are really two different ways you could go about this. The first way is to appeal to this diversifying America and to begin to connect with these voters and to begin to respect and treat these voters as part of the coalition you wish to build. And after 2012, when Barack Obama won re-election with what's now known as the Obama Coalition, which was college-educated whites and then people of color across the board and younger voters. When Obama had one election in 2008 and one re-election in 2012, the Republican Party commissioned a study, a self-reflection, what was known as a kind of post-mortem, an autopsy of the election. And one of the major conclusions was this. In that report, they wrote that the Republican Party must focus its efforts to earn new supporters and voters in the following communities: Hispanic, Asian and Pacific Islanders, African Americans, Indian Americans, Native Americans, women, and youth. Obviously, tremendous intersection among these categories. This priority needs to be a continual effort that affects every facet of our party's activities, including messaging, strategy, outreach, and budget. Unless the RNC, that's the Republican National Committee, gets serious about tackling this problem, we will lose future elections. This was one of the main recommendations in the Republican analysis post-2012. It was an assessment that the party, in order to win future presidential elections, to be a force in American politics, was going to need to build a message, a set of strategies, a set of outreaches to the diversifying America, what progressives call either kind of the rising American electorate or the new American electorate, this diversifying population. This report was not written by, but was overseen by, was supervised by the gentleman who became the first chief of staff for Donald Trump, Reince Priebus. Priebus had been the chair of the Republican Party in 2012 and 2013. He oversaw this and he believed that this was the way that the party should go. And when Trump was eventually elected, he brought in Priebus to be his chief of staff. It didn't go well. They clashed pretty quickly and Priebus headed out. All right. This is avenue one to being a political power in a diversifying America. Avenue two is to build and modify election systems so that white Americans can maintain power even though the country is getting more diverse. In that kind of avenue, you engage in voter suppression techniques and also laws, and you run campaigns specifically designed to prioritize the population that you want to reach. If you want white American voters to stay in positions of power, even in a diversifying America, then you need to create a system where the population might be getting more diverse, but the voting electorate continues to be white Americans who are prioritized. That is clearly the direction that the Republican Party has gone. This is the avenue they've taken. So I want to just kind of take a look at this by looking at 4 populations and looking at them across 3 elections. I want to look at white voters, African American voters, Latinx voters who are, that's a terminology that I'm not sure everybody's familiar with, but Latinx is a terminology that captures Latinos and Latinas, which are gendered usages of they're gendered references to people that are present in the Spanish language. But Latinx kind of removes the gendered element of it, and Asian Americans. So whites, African Americans, Latinx, and Asian Americans. And I want to look at 3 presidential elections. I want to look at the support that Barack Obama received among these populations in his 2012 reelection. I want to look at Donald Trump's support in 2016 in his election. And then I want to end this slide by looking at George W. Bush's support among these populations in 2004. So Barack Obama, and this is why it's represented in blue in this slide, won these percentages across these populations in his reelection in 2012. He won 39% of white voters, which is low, but is not like off the charts low for Democrats. The Democrats have been losing less than 50% of white voters in America since the 1960s, since they became the party of civil rights in the United States. They've lost a majority of white voters, and it's been slowly declining over time. Obama was actually right at about, I think he got 43% in 2008 and 39% in 2012 among white voters. Among African Americans, he got 93% of the vote in 2012. Among Latinx, he got 71% of the vote in 2012. And among Asian Americans, he got 73% of the vote in 2012. This is what a diverse coalition looks like in the United States. A good chunk of white voters, not by any means just a small chunk. We're talking 40% of all white voters, and then a very large portion of African Americans, Latinx, and Asian Americans. This is the Democratic coalition as it exists. The numbers might move a little bit across a presidential campaign or across certain elections in the country, but in general, the Democrats pull together this diverse collection of voters. This is part of the challenge for the Democratic Party at all times. Donald Trump in 2016 got these percentages among the same groups. Among white voters, Donald Trump got 58% of the vote in 2016. Among African Americans, he got 7% of the vote. Among Latinx, he got 27%. And among Asian Americans, he got 23% of the vote. This is what a white-dominated coalition looks like. Because there are so many more white voters in the United States than in the other 3 categories, the percent, if you take a large percentage, whether it's 40% or 58%, the numerical dominance of white voters becomes overwhelming. Particularly when they become almost 6 out of 10 voters in your coalition. This is Donald Trump's coalition in his presidential election in 2016. "12 years earlier, George W. Bush won re-election in 2004 narrowly. He didn't win by much. He got, I think, 51.7% or 51.3% of the vote. Not a lot. But a majority of the popular vote. It is, I want to make sure I got this right here. '92, '96, 2000, 2004, 8, 12, 16. In George Bush's majority of the popular vote in 2004 is the only time in the last 7 presidential elections that Republicans have won a majority of the popular vote. The only time in the last 7 elections that the Republicans have won a majority of the popular vote. But yet they've won 3 presidential elections. I'm sorry, 4 presidential elections in there. 2000, 2004, no, 3. 2000, 2004, and 2016. But you go all the way back to 1988 and then 2004 as the last majority popular votes for the Republicans. In 92, Clinton won. In 96, Clinton got a majority, a plurality in both of those. In 2000, Gore got the majority. In 8 and 12, Obama got the majority, and in 16, Clinton got the majority. So the Democrats have a much larger percentage of the U.S. population. When you look at the coalition that Trump put together, that coalition was dominated by white voters. Bush in 2004, when he got a majority, he also drew very well among white voters. And so I'm going to show you group by group here what they did, what Bush did in 2004 relative to what Trump did in 2016. In 2004, Bush got 59% of white voters, but he also got 11% of African Americans, up 4% from Trump, and he got 43% of Latinx voters, and he got 41% of Asian Americans. This is the highest number that we have seen among a Republican president in some time among Latinx, but among Asian Americans, it has long been a tendency of Asian Americans to support Republicans. They have been traditionally more Republican as a voting constituency in the United States, but that has changed dramatically over the last 12 years or so. But you can see that Bush's coalition is much more diverse than Trump's coalition. So the white voter racial homogeneity that has occurred among the Republican Party is significant. They have a voting population that is increasingly white voters. This drives messaging, this drives strategy, this drives states that they focus on, all kinds of things. This is one of the ways that the Republican Party got to this cult of Trump. The more homogeneity you have ideologically, racially, then the reality is that the more you are going to become a space of only certain perspectives, certain worldviews getting a kind of platform to stand on. Okay, the second way that the party got here is what I'm going to call leadership racial homogeneity. So previously, in my previous point, it was voter racial homogeneity. Here, we're going to call it leadership racial homogeneity. Who leads this party? And by leaders, I mean public-facing leaders, folks who are in office around this country. And when you look at governors, House of Representatives, Senate, and the presidency. So I want to, for purposes of just to kind of illustrate this, I want to take an incredible slide or data point, set of data that's been put together by a guy named Charles Gaba. Charles Gaba in 2013 built something called ACA signups. ACA signups is a website that tracks how many people have signed up for the Affordable Care Act. The Obama administration did not roll out the Affordable Care Act effectively, and they didn't really have a system to track the signups very well. And also, as a point of critique of the Affordable Care Act, many conservatives and Republicans would make claims about the very small enrollments that were there. So Gaba, who's a health kind of expert, just started to collate data using Affordable Care sign up exchanges around the country and began to collect those, and has now become the go-to site for ACA signups in this country. And it's considered completely nonpartisan. It's considered an authoritative collection of how many people sign up, when do they rise, when do they fall. As a quick aside, Donald Trump had the opportunity during the pandemic right now to reopen the Affordable Care Act signups for people to gain health care in this moment at a very low cost, and he refused to do that. It's just one more instance of the way that he isn't willing to kind of like preside and present opportunities for people to take care of themselves. It's got to be his way or the highway. But GABA collects this information and tracks it. And what he put together that I came across a few months ago was an ethnic breakdown of the 2019 House of Representatives, the folks that were in the U.S. House of Representatives as of the end of 2019. These are folks that were elected in 2018 and then took office in early 2019, and they're still in office right now. They represent the composition of the Congress. And in this data, there's a few folks you can see across the top there who are not included in the data because they were vacancies, or they didn't fall into, in one case, an independent position. They weren't a Republican or a Democrat. But that's 5 people, 4 vacancies plus 1 independent. You're still talking 430 members of the U.S. House of Representatives. So over here on the right side is the ethnic breakdown, racial/ethnic breakdown of the Democratic coalition that's in the House of Representatives. This is the composition of the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives. The largest group are white men. They're at 38% of the Democratic coalition. Next up are white women. They're at 19%. And then you have 12% African-American men. You have 9.5% African-American women. You have 10% Latinx men. You have 5% Latinx women. And then some smaller clusters for Native American women. The 2 Native American women are Deb Haaland of New Mexico and Sharice Davids of Kansas, 2 incredible heroes of mine. 6 Asian and Pacific Islander men, 7 Asian and Pacific Islander women. All of them combined 6.4%. When you look at these percentages, the racial percentages break down pretty close to the U.S. Census. The white population clocks in here at 57-ish, 58%, which is not far at all. It's just under the 2010 census, and it's about at where the 2020 census is going to come in. When you look at African-American population, it's actually overrepresented in the Congress relative to the broader U.S. population. The broader U.S. population is right at 13% for African-Americans. Here it clocks in at 21%. When you look at Latinx, that comes in right about what it is nationally, around 15%. And Asian Pacific Islanders also come in pretty close to where the population is at nationally. So the Democratic coalition is, I'm not here to say like these folks are perfect. God knows I have some major issues with a good number of the Democratic Party and some of the strategies the leadership engages in. But just in terms of racial and ethnic composition, in total, it looks fairly similar to what the United States broader population is. And this is, I think, what we should be striving for, a Congress that at least is as diverse as the broader US population, ideally more, but at least that. So let's then look over at the Republicans over on the left side of GABA's chart. And let's take a look at where they come in terms of racial composition. white men make up 89% of the Republican House of Representatives. 89% of the Republican House of Representatives. Right now, today, 2020, United States of America, one of our major political parties, the party that has control of the presidency and the US Senate, and until 2018 had control of the US House of Representatives, has a composition in the House of Representatives that is almost 9 in 10 white men. This looks, you know, if we were to go back 50 or 60 years, this is the kind of numbers that you would expect in 1950, 1960. I wouldn't like it about them, but that would be the numbers I would expect historically then. But here we are. This is horrifying. This says so much about the party, but it also says so much about the voters who select these people. There are 12 white women. So when you take all white representatives in the House of Representatives for the Republican Party, it's 95%. It's 95% of the Republican coalition in Congress. There's one black man, that's Will Hurd in Texas. Will Hurd is not running again in 2020. So there will not be an African-American man, at least unless a new person or two gets elected. There will not be an African-American man. There is not a black woman in the U.S. House of Representatives on the Republican side. There are a few Latinx, a couple Native American, no Asian American. So what we have is a white racial leadership homogeneity. So you've got it at the voter level, you've got it at the leadership level in this country. All right. These are two of the ways that the Republican Party has become the cult of Trump. They have become a monolithic body of folks, white Americans, white voters, white leaders. Trump didn't create this. Trump didn't start the fire. But Trump is the ultimate leverager, the ultimate kind of capitalist, in that he's come along and capitalized upon these and exacerbated them and made them even worse. All right. I know that this is a lecture that has some really troubling elements to it. This graph right here and that level of voter support, overwhelmingly white, is deeply concerning to me as a citizen and as an analyst. When I look at this as one of the major political parties in our country, it's not uncommon for people in the United States to look at, to the extent that they pay any attention at all, at political systems in other countries around the world, and to point to parties and leaders in those parties as representing fringe elements or far right or neo-Nazi or racist voting blocs or leaders, and for us to call those out and to name them without any kind of hesitation. Well, those populations for those parties and leaders look a lot like this party right here, the Republican Party. Okay. Now the third reason how the Republican Party got to this, the cult of Trump. And I'm calling this the anointment. An anointment is a term, I don't know if it's solely used in religious circles, but it's a term that you will find in religious circles. And it refers to a kind of blessing or a kind of a knighting of someone where you say to them, you are chosen, you are the one, you are special, You are anointed for this moment. You are the chosen one. You are the special one. You are our person for this moment. And anointments, you can self-anoint, which Trump has done, but you can also receive an anointment where a group of people, often people in religious power, say to a person, you've received an anointing now to be the leader of this group, this church, this congregation, this religious kind of grouping. It's a very big deal. It bestows authority upon those leaders, and then they move with that authority. So when the Pope becomes the Pope in the Catholic Church, that is an anointing of the Pope by the cardinals who select the Pope. And that anointing carries with it, that kind of bestowing of power upon them, carries with it this idea that God, this idea of a supreme being, wants this, the anointment. So in choosing this word, I spent a little bit of time thinking about whether or not this was a little too strong or not, and I've concluded it's not. It actually fits, just like the cult concept fits. So the anointment in this case is done by white evangelicals. This is a picture at an Alabama rally in 2016 with Donald Trump when he's running for president. I'm just going to let you take it in for a second. Everything about this picture, this photo, and I could have brought in other ones, captures the idea of an anointment. The idea that Jesus, in this perspective, has given Donald Trump to America for this moment. That's an anointment idea. Then you have the perspectives, the kind of emotional posture of the supporters towards the anointed one, the kind of grasping, the in awe of. Obviously, the most dramatic is the woman in front, but as you look around the photograph, you can see a number of people with these facial expressions, all of which, except for this gentleman in the lower left corner, look to me to be white. And in Iowa and South Carolina, when a group of folks in each of those states traveled with myself and with a few others to see the Democratic candidates campaigning in this state, in this election, we spent 5 days in Iowa and then 5 days in South Carolina before the caucuses in Iowa and before the primary in South Carolina. Donald Trump gave rallies in each of those states on the eve of the voting. It's part of what he did in February instead of preparing the country for the coronavirus. Trump gave rallies, and in each of those places, a few of the people that were in our group wanted to go to the Trump rally. And so that some went to it in Iowa, in Des Moines, and some went to it in South Carolina, in Charleston. And the populations there were overwhelmingly white at those rallies because these are the supporters of Donald Trump. So the anointment comes from a certain body of voters, white voters, but it comes particularly from a certain subset of white voters in the Republican Party, white evangelicals. And evangelicals are people who believe certain things about the kind of teachings of the Bible and scriptures, about kind of the infallibility of certain kind of ideas brought from God through Jesus to the world. And white evangelicals are the core supporters in the Republican Party. They are the strongest supporters of the Republican Party generally and of Donald Trump. So let's go back in time a little bit. The Public Religion Research Institute, which goes by the acronym PRRI, Public Religion Research Institute, is a denominational, nonpartisan organization that does research on religion and politics. And in mid-October of 2016, mid-October in a couple different years, so the same time of the year though, mid-October, they asked this question: do you think an elected official who commits an immoral act in their personal life can still behave ethically and fulfill their duties in their public and professional life? This was the primary critique of Bill Clinton back when he had sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky. And it was a primary critique that he had lied, and he'd also had out of marital relations. And it was what many Republicans, and particularly white evangelicals, use as the basis for saying the fact that he needed to be impeached, that a person who commits an immoral act in their personal life cannot, according to white evangelicals and many Republicans, cannot behave ethically and fulfill their duties in their public and professional life. This is why PRI started asking this question. And PRI asked this question in mid-October of 2 different years. So they don't ask this all the time. They're not a polling firm that can do polls all the time. But they asked it in 2 different years in the month of October. They asked it in 2011 when Barack Obama was president, and many others were in leadership. And they asked it in 2016 during the campaign when Donald Trump was running for the presidency against Hillary Clinton. In 2011, I want to show you the percent of white evangelicals, just self-identified white evangelicals, the percent who said, yes, a person, an elected official who commits immoral acts can still behave ethically and fulfill their duties. This is the population, the percent of the population in 2011 said yes. 3 in 10, 30%. Now, this is a little bit higher than I would even expect among white evangelicals, given the rectitude that they demonstrated of the kind of moral claims during the Clinton presidency. But still, it's only 30%. 5 years later, Donald Trump is now the Republican nominee. He clearly has not lived a life of morality in many respects, in his businesses, in his personal relationships, in his kind of just general public personas. So Republicans and everybody was given this question again, and the percent of white evangelicals who said yes in mid-2016 is 72%. 72% of white evangelicals say yes to this question in October of 2016. This is the significant shift over time. This is an anointing in which white evangelicals say, you're our guy. You're our leader. We will break bread with you. We will be in communion with you. We will stand by you. We will support you. So let's look at exit polls across the four most recent presidential elections. And let's look at white evangelicals across these elections. What percent of turnout they were in each of the election, what percent of the voters overall were they, and then who did they support and what was the margin of their support. In 2004, white evangelicals represented 23% of the overall voting population in the presidential election. That's still a lot. It's 1/4 of all voters in the election. They are distributed, overwhelmingly in the Republican Party. Bush got 78% of those votes. So they represent 23%, 1/4 of the of all voters, and they represented 80%, essentially 78% of all. They gave 80% of their support to the Republican nominee. They are overwhelmingly the strongest body of folks in the Republican coalition. In 2008, white evangelicals became an even larger voting part of the population, partly because we begin to have voter laws that begin to prioritize white voters in our society. And so whites begin to become a larger percentage of the voting population. This is part of the tactics, the strategy. Voter ID as a set of laws begins to be created in the mid 2000s, starting in Indiana, and then begins to spread around the country. In 2008, John McCain won 74% of white evangelicals. A few more percentage points went towards the Democratic nominee, in this case, Barack Obama. There are a small chunk of white evangelicals who are liberal. They are part of a group, often a cluster, often kind of known as the religious left, but they don't carry near the power in our society that the religious right carries. But a few of those peeled off to go to Obama in 2008. In 2012, white evangelicals again were 26% of the voting population for that election, and Mitt Romney got 78% of their vote, back to the same number as George W. Bush in 2004. So then we get to 2016, when you have white evangelicals willing to change their kind of ethical calculus in their thinking about whether an immoral leader can be an immoral acting person can be an ethical leader. So in 2016, white evangelicals again are at 26% of the voting population. They are one of every 4 voters in presidential elections. Okay. And how they voted 81% for Donald Trump. 81%. I have no idea what political leaders genuinely believe. None of us ever know. This is the reality of people in leadership. We never know what they actually truly believe. What we do know is what they say. Okay? Those words may line up with what they believe. Impossible for us to know. We know what they say, and then we know what they do. Well, when you look at these four presidential candidates, George W. Bush, over the course of his kind of adult life, after he went through what he describes as a conversion experience in, I think, his early 30s, George W. Bush has been a very kind of outspoken person of Christian faith. Maybe he believes it, maybe he doesn't. I have no idea. But it's been a consistent part of his life, and he's sought to live this out in his personal life. John McCain, a life of conviction and fortitude, not particularly outspoken about his faith one way or another, but somebody who is certainly a person of character. Mitt Romney, a person of devout religious faith, a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints. Romney himself, part of a family, the Romney family, that is known as a Mormon LDS, a legacy LDS member, which means that they were there in Illinois when the faith was founded, and the group left Illinois and went across the country and settled in Utah. The Romney family traces their lineage all the way back to Nauvoo, Illinois, where the Joseph Smith shared his revelations and was eventually killed in Nauvoo, and the Mormons went west. Romney, a person of deep faith and conviction, even citing his faith as the core reason why he voted for the impeachment of Donald Trump. Donald Trump has no record at all of being a person of Christian conviction or Christian faith. He many times says things that make clear that he's not even conversant with the perspectives or the kind of language of faith in general. So he just doesn't fit white evangelicals at all if white evangelicals really place their faith at the center of who they are in their convictions and their decisions. But yet Trump got 81% of their vote, the highest of these 4 candidates. This is an anointing. This is white evangelicals giving him an anointing. A little bit more. I want to bring it up to right now. Some Pew data. Pew Research Center is this wonderful nonpartisan polling organization that does all of this great polling analysis on social issues, on technology, on politics, culture generally. I encourage you to take a look at it. I mean, this is robust data and it's easily readable. They have great write-ups. And one of the great things about Pew is they make all their data publicly available 6 months after they've collected the data. So you can actually get it. I have used Pew data in some of my research over time. This is a poll that they did in a survey that they did in March, just a few weeks ago. And they asked this question: how well does blank describe Donald Trump? And they asked this not just of Trump, but a series of political leaders. But how well does blank describe a political leader, in this case, Donald Trump? I want to show you the percent that said either it describes him either very well or fairly well. Okay. And I want to show you I want to share the percent that said that these two terms, morally upstanding and honest, describe Donald Trump. All right. This is all from survey data a month ago. And I want to show two populations. I want to show the broader U.S. adult population. What percent said that these describe Trump very well or fairly well? And then what about white evangelicals, the core of the Republican Party, the folks who've given him an anointing? Well, when we look at morally upstanding among U.S. adults, 32% say yes, this fairly well or very well describes Donald Trump. That is kind of like Donald Trump's floor, how far he can fall in the political arena. When you ask white evangelicals as a subset of Donald Trump supporters whether morally upstanding applies to Donald Trump, 61% say that it applies to him very well or fairly well. Those numbers should be reversed for a population that claims that their ethical and moral convictions are at the core of who they are. How about honest? What percent of US adults say that this applies to Donald Trump? 36% say that it applies to him fairly well or very well. This is all US adults. White evangelicals, 69% say that honest applies to Donald Trump, very well or fairly well. To me, this is a dereliction of the claims that the white evangelicals as a voting population have made for really since the mid-1970s, since Roe v. Wade, since their opposition to civil rights and women's rights generally, their opposition to end-of-life care that might lead to decisions to end lives. For decades, white evangelicals have spoken about a certain kind of moral viewpoint of the world, and this support of Trump runs completely counter to everything they've said. This has been a portion of my research in a book that I co-authored called The God Strategy. We devote a chunk of that book to the power of the religious right in American politics and the way in which they moved the Republican Party a certain direction. They moved the Republican Party to the right. What we see here is Donald Trump moving white evangelicals towards him. That is what a cult-ish environment looks like. People begin to change their worldview to line up with the perspectives offered by the dear leader. One more question, though, that I think really tells us a lot. This is from Pew, also in March. This is a question I had never seen from them asked before, but it has been, because you're going to see over time some data here. It's just something that I was not familiar with. Thinking about the way that things have been going in politics over the last few years on the issues that matter, do you think your side has been winning? This is a question asked in the survey. And I want to show you the percent of white evangelicals who answered yes to this question across the 4 years that the Pew Research Center has asked this question. Pew asked it in 2016. They asked it again in 2018, 2019, and 2020. And each of those years, they asked it fairly early in the calendar year, either in February or March. They did not ask it in 2017. Don't know why. Whatever, they just didn't. So I have data. We can see data over time. I want to show you the percent of white evangelicals who say yes to this question across these 4 years. This is the percent of white evangelicals that say yes. They say their side has been winning. This to me is a straight up political calculus. It's a straight up political calculus. This is the guy. He delivers the judges at the federal level. Donald Trump has appointed more than 1/4 of all federal judges in this country, and Mitch McConnell's Senate has approved them, including 2 U.S. Supreme Court justices. If Donald Trump is reelected in 2020, it is almost a certainty, darn near 100% of certainty, that he will get to appoint 2 more Supreme Court justices. And those are both liberal justices, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Stephen Breyer. He will deliver the ones that the anointing group want. So white evangelicals are winning, and thus they're willing to get on board, to embrace, to modify their perspectives. Now, maybe all humans do this to some degree. Maybe we all are willing to shirk and drop a bit of our character and our integrity for some political victories. I'm certain I've done some of that. But this is a dramatic reversal. This is not a slight modification of like 1 click more liberal or 1 click more conservative. This is a complete reversal in terms of the claimed ethics of a voting bloc to support this gentleman, to see him as the chosen one, to claim he's the anointed, to stand by him through impeachment, through it all, through the coronavirus. This is the cult of Trump. Here's a political cartoon that kind of captures the dynamic. This is by Mike Lukovich, a couple Pulitzer Prize winning political cartoonists for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Here's Trump hugging a cross. This is late March of 2018, this cartoon, so it's tied to Easter. It's Trump hugging a cross, in which he's, of course, hugging the notion of like himself, a T for Trump. And over here are white evangelicals who look at him and say, look, he's so devout. And maybe they believe that, or maybe they don't, and they don't care because they're winning. This is the Republican Party today. It is, you know that kind of commercial that Pontiac had maybe 15, 20 years ago, where they said, this is not your parents' Oldsmobile. This is not the Republican Party that many of you who are watching this lecture remember. It's almost unidentifiable that you have an overwhelmingly white voter population, an overwhelmingly white leadership population, and you have an anointing from the key religious leadership in the organization, in the coalition. Okay, coming into the end here, this is the last slide. So going to be happy to do some question and answer after this for at least a few minutes. Stephen Hassan is the one who has written the book, The Cult of Trump, the book that I showed at the beginning of my lecture. Hassan has done a couple interviews. They're available around the internet. You can look it up. You can, search for them and find them. And he did an interview with Vox, which is an online news and opinion organization that is founded by and led by Ezra Klein, formerly the Washington Post, and now who's built a whole large media kind of set of entities on his own. Stephen Hassan did an interview with Klein that was part of a podcast that Klein does. And I want to finish with what Hassan had to say. Now, when Hassan's book came out, I've done some research on this now to kind of learn about this. Hassan took tremendous criticism among certainly defenders of Trump, but also others who weren't defenders of Trump, who were troubled by his use of the term cult. People who study cults felt that this was a diminishment of the power of the idea to kind of apply this term to a political leader. And many progressives really recoiled at the terminology as well, saying that, that isn't quite what's going on here, because clearly he's not engaging in, it's not a small group of people. It's not what we have traditionally assigned with the idea of a quote unquote cult. And so Hassan in this interview gets a question about this, about whether the word really applies to Trump and to this moment in American politics. And this is what he says. He says, the last slide, the whole portion of his answer. My reason for doing this book wasn't really about Trump or Republicans or Democrats. It was to take everything I've learned about how vulnerable human minds are and how psychology works. We're living in a very different world where the conventional idea of quote unquote brainwashing is really obsolete. And the idea of a cult as a small group of people sharing physical space is outdated. The internet has changed things. And I think Trump is an example of what a 21st century cult leader looks like. That's pretty deep. That's pretty strong of a claim. It makes me really start to think about the way in which technology, communication technology, and the social ties have changed in our world with the presence of the internet. In a moment like this, when I can give a remote lecture and hundreds of you can watch it and hopefully hear it and see it very well, I love what we have because of our technology. It's a uniting element. But it also, perhaps, these technologies allow the process of norms and practices and peer pressure and other kinds of social pressure to play out in other ways. The cult of Trump. That's where we exist in the Republican Party right now. You don't break a leader's power in a cult easily. These things do not end well. This is not going to go easy in our society. It's not going to go easy in this election. It's not going well in the coronavirus crisis. The things and the lashing out that he's delivering towards the press and towards governors and towards anybody who wants our president to be a good president. We're seeing it now in full display in front of us. We've got months to go. Hopefully we don't have years to go. So that's my lecture for tonight. I'll be happy to answer some questions. I'll be right back. Good night, Sam. I love you, bud. See you in the morning. Perfect timing. I had a chance to say goodnight to my son. I'm going to go off sharing my screen here and going to just talk now just directly to you in full screen and see what's here in the Q&A, some questions. Okay. Question one is, and you're welcome to ask, toss these into chat if you have questions, into the Q&A on the Zoom. Question one is the population of white evangelicals growing or shrinking as a I'm assuming this is as a population, not as a presence in the electorate. In the electorate, we saw those numbers. They've been solid at 26%, at least in presidential elections. They're actually much larger percentages in the off-year elections because they turn out to vote in such large numbers. But are they growing in the population? They have been slightly growing in the U.S. population over time. There's a two kind of counter trends going on in the American religious populations. You have a slightly growing white evangelicals population that is just inching up over time. And you have a very rapidly growing portion of what are called nones, N-O-N-E, no religious affiliations. Now, this could be atheists, could be agnostics, or it could just be people who don't claim any religious affiliation at all. But nones are rapidly growing in the American population, and today are running neck and neck with white evangelicals as the largest cluster in the American population. They vote overwhelmingly for Democrats. So evangelicals slightly increasing, but nones are going up big time. So where are all those numbers coming from? They're coming, the declines are there among mainline Protestants and slight declines among US Catholics. Let's see. So here's a question. In the book, These Truths, they talked about polls and that they have been skewing things for a long time. Is this now different? So is this now different that polls skew things? I'm just looking over here at my bookshelf. The book is These Truths by Jill Lepore, a historian, and I've read the book. It's a great book. It's a quick overview of all of American history, so you know it doesn't have near the depth that you can get in other books, but it's a good overview of the tensions between a progressive set of ideals and a pushback and a conservative set of ideals over time. Are polls skewing things? So it's hard to kind of know exactly what the question is here, but I'll interpret it this way. Are our surveys and polls telling us things that are not accurate about what people in the public believe, and in regards to the candidates that they support or the issue positions that they believe in? Now, I actually believe that the polling is better now than it's ever been in American public life. The polls in politics are not actually off, tremendously so. The whole situation is that we have to average polls. Every single poll have margins of errors to them. This is how what's called probability sampling works. You take a subset randomly sampled of a broader population, and you can get to a degree of confidence that is a certain level of confidence that the numbers you get in your sample can be generalized to the broader population. The more people you sample, the larger confidence you can have that the data from the sampling can be generalized to the broader population. But you're never going to get perfect. You're always still going to have a couple percentages where you're off. So you have to average them. And the reality of human polling is that sometimes every poll here, there's going to be the occasional poll that's off. So you have to average them all. Are our polling data, I'll just answer this in the context of elections. Are our polling data off? Actually, the polls were very good in 2016. Hillary Clinton had about a 2 to 3% lead in the final set of polls before the election, and that's what she won in the general population. She won by 2 to 3 percentage points. She did. But in the American presidential context, national polls don't mean anything. We don't have national elections. I talked about this in the last lecture. We have electoral college elections. And so the reality is that we need to look at state-based polls. State-based polls matter. Right now in state-based polls, Donald Trump is trailing in enough states to lose, but it's extremely close in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and in the state of Arizona. It is the case that he is losing in the polls there, but that it's close enough that if those polls are slightly off, or that turnout changes from what the polls have, that Trump can win. So I would say that polling actually is more scientific and better done today, but we have to always take it as like a weather forecast. I think Nate Silver has used a very good analogy to weather forecasting, that weather forecasting over time has gotten much better, but that if you want to have really high levels of confidence, you need to look at like the cone of predictions. So when you look at hurricanes and the tracking of where a hurricane might go in a weather forecast, you will see the kind of cone of confidence that it's going to be somewhere between these kind of parameters. And that's the way we need to look at polls too, that the overall parameters give us a sense of them. What happens to the Republican Party if Trump loses in 2020? I don't know, but it's a big reckoning, because Trump, if he loses in 2020 and steps away, and those are different things, but if he loses in 2020 and leaves, he's not going to go quietly. He's going to just blast the Republicans generally. He's going to make them all pay. He does this constantly right now to people who've worked for him and other Republicans. If you cross him, you pay the price. So you would expect that it's going to have an internal civil war that'll be substantial. How it comes through that, I don't know. I'll just say very interestingly that both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have had members or clusters within their coalitions that have sought to move the party in certain directions in the last 20 years. In the Republican Party, it was the Tea Party, and they won. They took over the Republican Party, and Trump is their candidate. In the Democratic Party, it's been white progressives represented by Bernie Sanders. They have not won politically in the party. They have definitely moved the party on some issues, but they have not gained electoral power in the same way that the Tea Party gained electoral power in the Republican Party. There's various reasons why this is so, but when you think about just the Republican Party, it is the party of Trump. So if their dear leader is defeated, you can imagine it's going to be extremely difficult psychologically for everybody to deal with the fallout of that. The kind of I'll use this intentionally, the kind of come to Jesus moments that are going to be present for lots of people in that party. It won't be pretty. I would love to have a really healthy Republican Party. I would love it. Here's a great question. What happens? Here's the question. Isn't male identity almost or equally as important as white identity in the cult of Trump? I personally, from the data that I see and my own take on this, male identity is very important, but it is not as important as white identity here. Men support Trump much more than women do. That is the case. The gender gap between male voters and female voters in American population is he does much stronger, about 15 points stronger among men than he does among women. So yes, male identity matters for Trumpism. But the reality is that white women voted in a majority for Trump as well in 2016 nationally. And it continues. And right now it's split almost exactly at 50% between Trump and Biden for 2020 among white women. So to me, racial identity trumps gender in the political space to understand the cult of Trump. And I think in general, racial identity trumps gender in American life. But when you look specifically at elections, if white women were to move away from Trump to even a small majority away from Trump to 52%, 53, 51, Trump can't win. So white women, in particular, in my assessment of the cult of Trump, play a particularly important role. Okay. Why are the evangelicals, I'll do a couple more questions here. Why are the evangelicals such reliable voters? Well, white evangelicals in general are really reliable voters But evangelicals as a broader population across racial lines are also very reliable voters. There is a very large Black evangelical voter population in the United States. Many African Americans will self-identify as both Christian and as evangelical. Black evangelicals vote overwhelmingly Democratic in the society. They just aren't as large of a cluster in the population. White evangelicals are a fourth. Black evangelicals are about 11% of the population, and they vote very strongly for Democrats. In fact, the most consistent, and not just for Democrats, but the most consistent turnout population in the American electorate is Black women. They consistently turn out at a very high numbers in the population. This is why they truly are the base of the Democratic Party. So there's something, I think, written into the kind of cultural DNA of evangelicalism that comes with duty and responsibility, in the sense of adhering to believing in the system and to contributing kind of one's personhood to that space. So they just tend to turn out as very high voting populations in the American electorate. Question here about how am I defining evangelicals? I'm not actually defining evangelicals. For the most part, I'm using self-definitions. They are given these categories in these surveys, and they place themselves into these categories. The question is something along the lines of, do you have a religious affiliation? And if so, which of these is it? And evangelical is one of them, and people self-classify themselves into these categories. But in general, in the American population, evangelicalism is associated with a kind of a belief that the Bible is divinely inspired and is to be interpreted in as literal a fashion as possible. It's also to believe that our relationship with a supreme being, with God, is mediated by Jesus and only Jesus, and that relationship is an individualized relationship, not a collective one like you would find in a variety of Eastern faiths as well as in Catholicism, that it's rooted in a personal relationship. Okay. There's a question here about the media and the coverage of Trump. I'm going to just pass on that one for tonight, because I'm going to be talking about Fox News and the media system next week. So I'll just take that then. And I'll end with this question. Which states have the most active voter suppression efforts underway that will affect the 2020 election, especially with favorable judges appointed by Trump that could make these suppressive efforts successful? Well, voter suppression is going to be a point of focus of an upcoming lecture series that I'm going to do in early May. I announced today two lectures. Let me say it this way. Two lecture series, one on how Joe Biden can win and one on voter suppression in American politics. The Biden one is right at the end of April, and the voter suppression one is in early May. I'm also going to do a lecture tomorrow night that's available to anybody free at the YouTube website for Common Purpose. That's going to be about coronavirus in the elections, right in this election right now. So I will talk a little bit about voter suppression in the coronavirus one tomorrow, but I'll talk a lot more about voter suppression in the two lectures in early May. And you can find the lecture series about Biden and about voting rights generally, both on brown paper tickets. You can just do a search for me. And there's ticket prices that range from free up to some higher prices. I will answer the question this way and say that which states have the most active voter suppression efforts right now? Well, today in Kentucky, the Republican legislature overrode a governor veto of a voter ID law. So this is a brand new voter ID law. Even though fraud does not exist in the state of Kentucky around voting, there are no studies that suggest that it does exist. The Republican legislature, because they're pissed off that the Democratic candidate Andy Beshear won the governorship in 2019, they passed a new voter ID law, which requires you to show a form of government ID with a photo ID, with a photograph to it. They passed this. The Democratic governor, Andy Beshear, vetoed it. but the Republican legislature has a supermajority in the Senate and the House, and they overrode it today. So let's just get straight here. What happened here? They passed a new voter ID law requiring people to show their forms of identification in the midst of a coronavirus pandemic. So it becomes all the harder to show voter identification to registered voting and then to actually vote when you can't go to the polling locations without risking your life. That is happening. That happened just today in Kentucky. Wisconsin requires you to show voter ID when you register to vote, whether you're in person or doing it remotely. So right now, if you want to vote in Wisconsin, and I believe it's the same thing in Ohio, you have to get a photocopy of your identification, and you have to submit it with your ballot request. So if you're already registered to vote, in order to get the ballot, you have to get a photocopy of your photo ID and send it in with your application for a ballot in order to get a voting ballot to vote. Usually you just have to show it when you go to vote, which is bad enough. But now you have to somehow get a photocopy of it, mail it in, or upload it as a PDF for those places where you can do this electronically and send it in. Certainly we can do this, but it's complicated. And one of the things that happened in Wisconsin in the last 10 days, well, not the last 10 days, but the last 10 days before the election that was just held there on April 7th, is that folks had to get used to this system on the fly. And as I'll talk about tomorrow night, they did. It can be done, but it can only be done, this kind of learning, with the great support of volunteers who are willing to call in, text in, email, letter write, and help these folks to figure it out. It's very difficult. So what states? Wisconsin's brutal on this. Ohio is tough on this. North Carolina has been trying to pass voter suppression laws. They've gotten some of those passed. They've gotten some others thrown out by the U.S. Supreme Court and the state Supreme Court. They were supposed to have a new voter ID law in place in 2020 right now, but it's been put on hold by the state Supreme Court in that state. We'll see if it gets put back into place. Florida has a voter suppression practice right now where in 2018, Amendment 4 was passed, which restored voting rights to 1.6 million people formerly incarcerated who had been lifetime disenfranchised for committing a felony. They got their voting rights restored with Amendment 4 in 2018. And then the Republican Party, when it convened in 2019, promptly put a set of restrictions on that and said that, yep, you have the right to vote, but before you can actually vote, you have to pay off all of your legal fees, which for many of them are quite sizable. It really immediately disenfranchised about 600,000 of those folks. But right now that new Republican law is being challenged in the courts by progressives, by the ACLU, and a whole bunch of others. And we'll see if that law holds up, this kind of restriction on the voting rights of people in Florida. So I could go on in other states. In Michigan, you have to show voter identification as well. In the state of Pennsylvania, you need to show voter identification. In several southern states, Georgia and Texas, there is the moving of polling locations, the shutting down of polling locations. So it's out there, and it's a lot, and it takes a lot of work and emphasis, and that's the body of work that I'm committed to right now, that many of us are committed to in this organization, Common Purpose, and other organizations around the country. So I'd love to have you join me for the lecture tomorrow night at the Common Purpose YouTube site, or to sign up for that voter series that's going to be early May. So I'm going to wrap it up here. Say thank you so much for joining me on this lovely evening, April 14th, 2020. We are slightly over 100 days into the calendar year of 2020. And we are making our way towards the most important election of our lifetime. Tonight, I talked about the cult of Trump. We are in uncharted waters, as I talked about last lecture. Next lecture, I'll talk about the amplification effect of Fox and other conservative media outlets. Let's be well, let's be safe, let's be determined. All right. Thank you so much. We'll see you later.